For all its problems, for all the post-colonial deconstruction stuff that you can throw at the museum, all of the problems with it as an institution, it still retains a great deal of potential. The point is, the fact that so many people are getting worked up about it, I think at least says they care.
Okay, here we go. Okay. Hello, welcome to another episode of Evil O. This is Wazil X Wazil from Udaipur. Today we're talking about museums, and I'm very lucky to be talking with Mrinalini Venkateswaran. She is somebody with a background in archaeology, and she's just received her doctorate degree, which we're congratulating her for today. But she was a consultant most recently with the Maharaj Sawai Singh Man Singh II Museum in Jaipur. It's better known as the City Museum in Jaipur. And she has two books out. One of the books is called Painting and Photography in the Jaipur Court. I got that right. So without saying anything more, here is Mrinalini. How are you today?
Thanks, Wazil, for the introduction. I'm very well, thank you.
I hope I got that all correct.
Pretty much, yes.
Pretty much. What did I make a mistake on?
Oh, no serious mistakes. Just, the most of the names of the museums I've worked for are mouthfuls because many of them are palace museums. So you get the whole, name of a person, including titles. And so it can get the order of things. The sequence can sometimes trip any of us up.
You've been working in the museum cultural industry now for, what did you say, 15 years about?
Yeah, my maths is not my strongest suit. So my first job was in 2006 in India. I briefly worked when I was finishing up my master's degree at Durham in the UK, and I did a little bit of work, but it was more like an internship there for the university museums. But I came back to India in early 2006, and so I've been working in the museum field since then.
And you were born in Chennai, which is where you're speaking to us from now, correct?
I was actually born in Indore.
You were born in Indore. Okay.
Yes. But I'm currently in Chennai, that's right.
She was just telling me before we went on air that she's allergic to mosquitoes and that the mosquitoes in Chennai drove her crazy as a child. Which
they still do.
They still do.
Apparently they have a special, because I was looking this up just to remind myself because I'd forgotten about it, having been in the UK for a couple of years. And even Delhi has fewer mosquitoes. So apparently they're attracted to certain blood groups, and mine, I think, may be one of them as well. So who knew?
Yeah, they are actually. I drive people crazy because mosquitoes are not attracted to me. So I can sit in a bunch of mosquitoes and they're biting everybody else and they don't touch me. Yeah. I'm never bothered them. Maybe it's just because I have old elephant hide or something, but they don't really bother me. Mm. So anyway, let's start talking about the museum. You just spent a lot of time working up in Jaipur with the City Palace Museum. I'll call it that for short since I trip over the other elongated name. And I think the museum also just went through quite the renovation over the past few years. Looks beautiful, absolutely stunningly beautiful. And the first exhibition was on painting and photography in the Jaipur Court. I believe that was the inaugural exhibition. So why don't you talk a little bit about how you worked with the museum there and that whole process and what has brought it into the contemporary age? To me, it's now a museum that's on the map that people should go and visit.
So the Painting and Photography Gallery at the City Palace Museum was very much a team effort, as have all the projects I've been involved in there. I'm not leading the charge on my own. It's very much it requires a team. It's a vast, complex, literally as well as figuratively, in terms of all of the people working behind the scenes. So I think that gallery was really one of the things that the larger renovation. I mean, it's generous of you to say that we've done it. We haven't. It's very much a work in progress. COVID, of course, has put a spanner in the works. And so the next project that we were working on, and we've just started building work, was a new transport gallery. So that had to come to a halt. But going back to the painting and photography gallery, that actually started with a reassessment or a reevaluation of the museum's painting collections. The City Palace in Jaipur has been for a very long time. I mean, so it was first in the 1950s, 54, I believe, that it was first opened as a museum, not necessarily in this form, because it was Maharaja Savai Bhavani Singh who founded the trust in memory of his father. He kind of refounded the trust. So the present name of the museum trust is that of his father. But it had been, that was in the 70s, but it had been opened as a museum well before that, in the early mid-50s. And so at a really interesting moment, actually, because India, of course, gained independence in 1947, and all the princely states of various sizes and capacities were absorbed into the Indian Union. It's a really interesting moment in Indian political history, and this point when there's a new nation that needs to be forged as much as imagined into being, as it were. And here the Maharaja of Jaipur, having kind of given up his ruling powers, but nevertheless he was the Raj Pramukh, so he was kind of the equivalent of the governor of the state. He opens this museum in his palace, and people are able to come in and see. Not just the wow factor is definitely a factor, and in Jaipur's case, where, as in many other palace museums actually, but certainly in Jaipur, we're lucky that the buildings, the complex itself is such a fantastic showcase. I mean, that's really part of the museum. It's not just, the objects, as it were, in showcases. It's the space and the buildings, and, such a wonderful legacy of architecture and urban planning from the 18th century. So he opens up this palace, and sure, it's the wow factor, but certainly it's also a wonderful way for people to take pride in the kind of artistic legacy that Jaipur as a state, so not just the court, but what Jaipur produced, because obviously a lot of things that were produced in Jaipur were also there.
What year was this that he opened it? What year was it that he opened the museum?
1954 is my memory,
okay.
But I could be off by a year or so, because 1954.
So shortly after independence.
Oh yeah.
And the intent of the museum when he first opened it was to allow people in Jaipur in the princely state to take pride in their heritage in some way. That was a big part of the idea.
I personally think, and I say this, and the reason I'm getting confused between 1952 and 54 is because I've seen correspondence in the National Archives, which I think might be the earlier date, which is very much about, indeed, asserting Jaipur's place as this wonderful center for art, and that people have been visiting for 200 years, because this was also the period when the National Museum was trying to put together a collection. Yes, there was a kind of nucleus of a collection based on an exhibition that had been sent to Britain, believe it or not, just on the cusp of independence. So that exhibition ran at the Royal Academy from November 46 to November 47 to February 48.
They sent an entire portfolio of miniature paintings, didn't they?
Oh, yeah, and many of the princes lent. And so but they were loans, crucially, but there were also things from government-owned, so a lot of it archaeological material or kind of sculpture, which sort of counted as archaeology as far as the Brits were concerned. So a lot of that material formed the core of it. And so that when that came back, that ended up becoming the core of the National Museum's collection. But there was also an active acquisitions program. So this was also the period when they were trying to either buy or secure loans, including from the princes. And Jaipur is one of them. And so it's fascinating. A lot of them said, of course, we'd love for there to be a great national museum reflecting the culture and art and, all of that legacy of India as a whole. But, Jaipur is well known as a center for this. So I think I'm going to open my own museum as well. So yes. It's a really interesting response to independence and this move to establish a national museum. So I think that that it operated at two levels. Yes, okay. It was
similarly to Gaikwad in Baroda. Gaikwad in Baroda also opened a museum and competition almost.
But in his case, the museum opened well before independence. So, and that was to the public. That was open to the public well before independence. So, I mean, I think there are slightly, but again, it's just, I think you're right in describing it as competition. But in that case, I think it was competing with a colonial sort of view of India and Indian art and craft, etc., and Indians' ability to be patrons and connoisseurs. So it was competing with a slightly different thing. But here, I think it was about both, yes, about being able to connect with wider audiences who, might come, because people have been, tourists to Jaipur for centuries. It's not, in just the last 20 years or whatever.
Right.
So in that sense, speaking to that wider audience, but also certainly, I think, reaffirming Jaipur's place in the nation, if you will.
So the museum was opened and it had a multifold purpose.
That's
and
my interpretation.
One was to give some sort of sense of cultural pride to the locals, and one was to extend the knowledge of the heritage of Jaipur beyond the city's borders and internationally.
That's how I see it, yeah. I mean, and I see it not necessarily because, or not only because I've been working there or associated with it, with the museum for so long, but also just because of my recent, my recent research, which has got me thinking about these issues.
Right. Now, I always understand that before the arrival of the British, that there really wasn't a museum culture in India the way we think of it in the West at any point. Would you agree with that or no? Or was there a museum culture, but maybe in a different form, maybe archives and temples or something like that? Or is it totally a foreign import conceptually, the museum?
Well, the current form of the museum is pretty much a foreign import, but I would just question, I think, the idea that, we're sort of stuck with the word, I suppose, and that tends to shape the ways in which we think about the institution. But I would question that as a kind of single model. I think what a museum encapsulates within it, historically as well as now, patronage and connoisseurship are elements that it encapsulates. Learning, sharing. So historically there have been different modes of doing this. I don't want to get into critiquing that. That's not my point. But within that wider context of collecting art and of enjoying it and of supporting art and creativity, showcasing it, consuming it. Of course, there's a tradition of that, and in India, and it's been in recent years. I don't mean the last 2 or 3 years, but say in recent decades that aspect of kind of indigenous modes of collecting and consumption and what they mean has seen greater scholarly interest and research. And there's some really interesting work out there on it.
Oh, definitely over like the past 15 years when you have things like the Museum of Art and Photography opening in Bangalore, and you had the expansion of the National Gallery of Modern Art in New Delhi, and even the National Museum in Delhi has sort of gone through also like a renovation and has really like come alive in many ways.
I'm glad you think that. I mean, I think renovations are, that's slightly different from what I was saying there. I mean, what I was trying to get at was that there were reasons for collecting and consuming art that grew from that were intrinsic or inherent to Indian culture. So you might consume artwork. So, the best example, of course, being miniature paintings, which are actually made to be viewed like this, not framed on a wall. Not to say you can't frame it on a wall. We have different concerns today about, preserving them and blah, blah. That's fine. These things also change. But, that's a really good example. Also, you get these colonial accounts of all of these, Wajid Ali Shah or Sarfoji in Tanjore, collecting instruments and artworks and peacocks and clocks. And, the way it was spoken about by the Raj and Europeans in general was just these Indians, they just have no taste, they just collect everything just as long as it's exotic, we can just kind of fob anything off on them. I mean, the European cut glass industry, the crystal furniture, chandeliers, I mean, you'd have seen this in Udaipur, at the peak of the industry, particularly the colored glasses were sent for export to Turkey, so the Ottoman Empire, but also were intended for India because, Indians like colorful things, so the way in which
Indians will buy Burano glass. They buy Burano glass really easy. Doesn't mean have to be good quality. They'll buy it.
Yeah, it's colorful. So, I mean, the way in which the reasons for that collecting were interpreted was perhaps not on the ball. And that's what all of this research has been unpacking, that it's about, that it relates to, the magnificence that a prince or a ruler is supposed to show, curiosity about the world. So there's lots of other reasons why we collect and consume art or novelties or, things like that, the kinds of things that you would find in museums. But going back to your other point, which is about renovations and, many museums getting a new lease of life. What do you think as a visitor? I mean, you've been visiting India for so many decades now, and you've seen the kind of change, even in places like Udaipur where you live, but also when you travel. What kind of
20 years ago, the museums were quite horrendous, to use that word, in many ways. I mean, Tommy and I have horror stories about visiting some Indian museums and literally seeing like antique terracottas that had been like literally pushed off pedestals and were just laying broken on the floor. And when you called the attention to the guard or the authorities, they kind of shrugged their shoulders like, oh yeah, that happened a month ago. Nobody's done anything yet. Kind of, stories were told to us. And it was just, the only word that comes to mind is horrendous. It was like, well, people aren't taking care of what they have, in these museums. But I mean, those are the old days. It's not like that anymore. And I think the museums are doing a much better job, by and large, they are. Now, maybe I'm sounding very Eurocentric and arrogant in speaking that way, but I mean, that's to me what I observed. I think everything's doing much better these days. Now, when I go to an exhibition, it's quite incredible to me most of the time. But I think there's a horrible lack of infrastructure still. I mean, a lot of these places are really cursed with the National Gallery of Modern Art in Mumbai. I mean, they have horrendous storage space, where they store things, which I saw when I was traveling to print exhibitions. Like, well, how can you store artwork in these rooms that literally leak everywhere during the monsoon? And yet you're storing artwork in them. So, I mean, that lack of funding, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you that I won't name the institution, but it's surprising how many institutions around the world have leaky storage for their collection. Because speaking to friends, because we're used to thinking that, oh my God, we're the worst case situation in India. Not so, really.
Not compared to Italy, probably.
Sorry?
Not compared to Italy, probably. Italy has horrible problems with their artwork.
Sorry, I lost you for a bit. Not compared
I said to Italy has horrible problems with their artwork. Every year a large number of paintings just disappear from Italian museums and churches because they're not even under proper security. So people just walk off with things. They walk off with a little tiepolo in their arm.
Yeah. So, but also, stuff gets dripped on everywhere. So it's an ongoing battle, I think, in that sense. That's genuinely shared. Not everybody's lucky to have, fantastic, or even good, never mind fantastic, just good, competent infrastructure.
But I think that goes back to the problem too about the perception of the museum and the purpose of the museum. I think sometimes politicians, either they think that a museum is just a place to hold old, rather irrelevant artifacts. Many politicians probably don't even understand why they're being held, or else they think that the museum's only purpose is to serve as a educational institute, which is meant to indoctrinate a younger generation in a particular sense of patriotism or ideology, whatever. But I don't think you find many politicians who have a purist sense of the museum. It's just something that is culturally necessary for a healthy society.
Well, I think, I think that I have my doubts on, what a purist museum might be and whether it ever really existed, because I think, going back to the sort of founding of the institution, if you will, I mean, I don't think you can get away from the politics really ever. So regardless of what kind of political purpose is being used for or use it's being put to, I think if one scratches the surface, or maybe just a little bit more than the surface, one will always find some other underlying purpose. So, but having said all that, I think the thing that gives me hope as a museum professional, sort of by and large, I mean, we all have problems, and I say this of colleagues in other parts of the world as well. I'm amongst other things, I've been involved with the Commonwealth Association of Museums for many years. And so regularly, every 3 years at the triennial, I do meet up with colleagues around the world. And a lot of the challenges sound similar. But despite all of those challenges, I am encouraged by the fact that museums still seem to matter to a lot of different kinds of people. So even in India, yes, of course you have the government museums, but I was just talking to you earlier about the kinds of motivations for setting up a museum in Jaipur or other princely states. But if you just think back to more recent years, so whether it's something like Anandpur Sahib, which is the Khalsa Museum there, not the Gurdwara itself, but the Khalsa Museum, which, why pick that as the mode in which to tell that particular story? If you think of something like the Remember Bhopal Museum, which is at the other end of the spectrum in terms of being low-tech, like poorly funded. I mean, we think we have problems. Those guys it's really about a survivor-led, community-owned in that sense. Right. For a museum and what it can do and the potential that it has to communicate. And if you think to, your part of the world, North America, sort of broadly, not just the US, my experience is a bit limited to a visit to Canada in this context, is the huge emphasis that First Nations place on having their own, they tend to call it interpretation center, but museum/interpretation center/cultural center, essentially to tell their own story, with their own voices. So I am, for all its problems, and, I say this to friends as well, for all its problems, for all the post-colonial deconstruction stuff that you can throw at the museum, all of the problems with it as an institution, it still retains a great deal of potential. And I think genuinely, it can never be neutral, and I think it can never perhaps tell everybody's stories. But I don't think that it means it's a failure or irrelevant. I mean, if you just also think about all of in recent years, all of the furore over museums and decolonizing museums, particularly. I'm a bit more familiar with the UK context, but generally in Europe as well, more broadly. Wherever you sit on the spectrum, the fact that so many people are getting worked up about it, I think at least says they care. So clearly they still matter at some level, right? So, I take encouragement from that.
You want to get on that topic, I think, because when we butted heads a few times on Facebook about that, I think I made a post that said, well, they had that meme going around about decolonize your library, and I said de-postmodernize your library. I made a meme of my own. But on some level, I understand the decolonization movement because, yeah, you don't want everything to come from a Eurocentric perspective. And you need to open it up to other cultures and other places and other viewpoints and all of that. But then at the same time, I start to bristle when I feel like, we were talking about in Jaipur that one of the reasons the museum was initiated was to give people a sense of local pride. So it's sort of like when you decolonize to a certain point, then you have to realize, there's a local pride in the UK also that has to be catered to some extent. And, when that starts to threaten, then you wonder, well, does the museum really work against its own function?
But I have two responses to that. I mean, I think the first is a slightly more general one that, museums, if have had to evolve and change, even though they do it, sometimes one feels at a glacial pace. And I think we're in the middle of a churn, a churn that feels a bit more like a churn, even though, changes have been happening incrementally.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an institution that, has evolved to respond to politics around it, whether it's independence, speaking in an Indian context, whether it's independence or, what have you. But my only other sort of caveat, if you will, with regard to what you were saying, is that yes, it's perfectly reasonable to speak of local pride or a local story, but I think the thing to remember that what local means has changed over time, and I think it's really that's the point. So if your local today is a diverse neighborhood, why is it that you're only telling one kind of local story?
That you're only telling an Anglo-Saxon story.
Exactly. So because that just reinforces the idea that non-Anglo-Saxons have no business being there, and that's not true. It's not just a kind of quid pro quo. You were in my neck of the woods, so this is payback time. It's not that really, because human beings and cultural exchange and just population movement have been going on for centuries. It didn't begin with the East India Company. So right. I think that just sort of telescopes these things into really black and white positions, which I think we lose something in that process.
I agree with you to a large extent. And like you say, we're going through a large churn. I think that's what you said. That's a nice terminology, a churn in society. But some of it, as an older person, 67 years old, I mean, just last night before bed, I read the article and I was just like, I want to use the word aghast. But in San Francisco now, they're renaming something like 44 schools, and because they decided that their namesakes had political issues. Okay, so one of the schools that's going to be renamed is Abraham Lincoln, because they decided Abraham Lincoln is a bad guy. Because even though he headed the Civil War to free the slaves, and he was the one who signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he was also quite nasty to the Native Americans in Indian treaties and whatever. So it's like remove Abraham Lincoln's name. But when you get into those things, what I was thinking last night, it's when somebody rushes into a house, a burning building, to save some children. You call them a hero and you celebrate them as a hero, and you don't necessarily go back in their history and say, oh yeah, but he was a drunk and he beat his wife. It's like, no, he saved the children. That's what he will be remembered for. And I would apply that to somebody like Abraham Lincoln. And then I started thinking, like, with caste issues in India, I mean, if you start going through Indian art history or Indian history and deciding that, all these people have to go because they exhibited casteism at some point in their life or in their history, which nearly everybody did and probably continues to do to this day, you're not going to end up with many people left. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, it doesn't need to be put in context, but I mean, so if I'm not a great expert in American history, but yes, familiar with Abraham Lincoln. My only response to that, or the only response that occurred to me to what you were saying is that, well, if you asked the wife whom he was beating up, I mean, thinking of your analogy of the guy who ran in to save the kids from the burning house.
Right.
Yeah, if he was a wife beater, then his wife might have a different view of the matter.
Right.
So, and I think it's really, it's very easy to take polemical positions in this kind of debate. And I think to me, it's just about learning to see the other side of the argument, and particularly including in the context of things like Gupta art and casteism. Frankly, I mean, I think we need to be able to, I think it's healthy to be able to look at ourselves and our history critically, because everybody tends to think, oh my God, what's with all this self-flagellation, and we need to have pride. But I think surely it's more a testament to your strength of character, whether we're talking of individuals or communities, that we're able to step back and look critically and acknowledge the problems and use, if it's about an art, okay, it's still art, but use it to talk about the things that it's not saying as much as the things that it's saying, if you see what I mean. I mean, the value of these debates to me is that it's getting me to rethink these objects and what they might mean to some, versus how I might have looked at them till now. So yeah, I mean, I think that the tendency to get really worked up, and I do too. I might be sounding quite calm today, but I can get worked up about particularly, colonialism and all of this stuff. But I do think that genuinely, I don't think one size fits all approaches work in this particular context. I think one does need to take the time to step back and actually think about it. I don't think we need to be scared of being critical of ourselves. And I think it offers opportunities to genuinely make institutions like museums more inclusive in the kinds of stories they tell. And it's never going to be, we're never going to get, I think, the right answer every time. But I think the process is as important. And, it's a journey. So,
right. I mean, on that, I totally agree. I think there should be a multiplicity of views expressed. Yeah. And you need to examine things from different sides. And that's, to me, part of the function of education. It's part of the function of a museum.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, yeah, and I have no problems with the fact that, like in an art museum, and if they're showing works by Gauguin, to go into, Gauguin's life in Polynesia and some of the unsavory things about that life. It needs to be out there and people need to know. But that's a different thing than canceling Gauguin and saying, well, we shouldn't show him again. So, I mean, to me, that's a line. It's like Gauguin, to me, has earned his place in art history. And so you have to recognize it. You may not celebrate it in quite the same way as you did 50 years ago or 100 years ago, but you still have to recognize it, and you can still bring up all the other issues.
Yeah, and I guess there are lots of affirmative things that one could do to deal with these things, because of course the other thing point one could come up with is that you might be talking about everything that Gauguin got out of being in Polynesia and how his depictions might be repeating certain kinds of stereotypes, blah, blah. Yes, okay, you might talk about it, but you're still celebrating. But of course, the reason that you're celebrating when he's earned his place in art is because he was a white man in that kind of context, right? So, but I think there are affirmative things that one can do. I mean, maybe your American artists are overrepresented in global discourses on art. So maybe how do we address that? Like, can we provide better platforms for people from other parts of the world? I don't know. I'm not really contemporary art is not my thing, not my area of expertise in that sense. But I'm just saying that there are as I said earlier, that it's not a one size one solution for every such situation kind of response. I think we need to try and push ourselves to be creative with our solutions as much as we are with producing art.
What do you see? I want to get on to the books that you've written too, but before we go there, let's just end the museum segment by you talking about what do you personally see as the role of the museum And what to you is your ideal museum and how it should function within society?
That's a difficult question because I think partly it's about the needs of that society. And as I said earlier, museums have changed over the course of their history, and they have responded to the needs of society, the politics around them, things like that. And so for me, the most valuable aspect of a museum is, both as a visitor, I visit as many as I can, but also as someone who works in the field, is the opportunity to share and to learn. But we all go to museums for different kinds of things. And that's something that as a museum, somebody who's worked in a curatorial role, it's something that I need to remember, that people might be going to museums for shared family bonding time or to spend time with friends. And that's a perfectly legitimate reason to go to a cultural space, that it's about kind of the cultural space and that experience rather than, what you might learn about an object or a period in history or an event or, whatever. So we all go to museums for different purposes. And I think, if we're able to get some of that out of the visit, that would be ideal. But for me personally, it's about, learning. It's less about bonding with family. I tend to go to museums alone, at the most with a friend. And even if I'm with a friend, we kind of do our own thing and then maybe meet up to compare notes later. So I'm that sort of visitor. But for other people, it works differently. But yeah, I think that because they keep and should keep changing to accommodate the needs of that society. If they can address those needs, whatever those needs are, a range of needs are, then I think they meet their purpose.
Right. I see museums have a very important function in society. I came from a museum-loving family. In fact, there were people in my family who actually worked at the Natural History Museum in Milwaukee. So it's sort of like we had museum connections, and both the Natural History Museum and the Art Museum played very influential roles in my development as a child. So to me, I know that museums can have power over you as somebody growing up. It's a place I always loved to escape to.
The funny thing is, I never really went to very many museums when I was a child. I think I must have gone to the museum in Chennai as a school kid. I haven't been since because I haven't lived here for many years. And when I've come, it's been for family, reasons, and there's been some function or program or somebody getting married or whatever. So, not really much time to do, or work. So not much time to do anything else. So I didn't actually grow up going to museums too much, except maybe if, one was being a tourist, went to London as an 8-year-old. So obviously went to Madame Tussauds, that kind of thing, Yeah, so it's interesting that I don't know, my family wonders where I came up with it from.
I want to ask that question. Is that changing? Are Indian families becoming more the sort of people who take their children to museums these days, do you think?
Well, Indian families...
That culture growing?
Well, we're not a homogenous kind of family, are we?
No.
I do. So one of the books that that sticks with me is a book on the Lahore Museum by a friend called Shaila Bhatti. And one of the things that she points out is that, South Asians have had their own way of engaging with collections and art, and with museums even. And and I agree with her attempt to revive this kind of discredited notion of the Ajaib Ghar. So that's what museums were often called, wonder houses. Houses of wonder, and it's dismissed as this kind of as a kind of you try and teach these Indians how to properly appreciate art or objects or whatever, but it's just a house of wonder to them. So, and I think that we've imbibed that too much, and so. Her point is that, it works. It actually works better. Not many Indians are not like me. They don't want to go to museums alone. For them, it is a social occasion. It is about going with parents, grandparents.
It's a wonder house. I like that word.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's the word in, what was it, Hindi?
Ajaib Ghar, it's Urdu. Ajaib Ghar.
Urdu.
Well,
Okay.
Hindi, Hindustani, however you want to call it. I mean, Hindi and Urdu themselves are distinctions that have.
I like that concept of going to a wonder house.
Yeah. So I mean, I think because that's the kind of that's why I love the work that I do, whatever the challenge is, because they are houses of wonder. One gets the chance to work with these amazing objects and all the kinds of histories that they can, stories that they can tell you. It's like peeling an onion, layer after layer. There's something.
I still go through that when I go through like historical palaces and forts sometimes, and I get guides, and they want to guide me through and tell me the whole history as to why the fort and the palace were there and all the successions of rulers and blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, to me, it's just a wonder house. I just want to walk through it and look at it visually and be in awe.
Yeah.
At how beautiful it is, and that's a whole different kind of experience.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate way to experience a museum, especially like, for example, places like Jaipur, which are as much about the space as well as the things. And so going back to your question, I think that when we wonder, are more Indian families visiting museums? I mean, at some level, they've been visiting museums for a long time. I guess the question is, what do we think is a successful visit as a museum professional? What do I think is a successful visit? And so partly, I think it's about changing one's own mindset. So, for example, in Jaipur, when the Albert Hall, what was the Albert Hall is now the government central museum, when that opened, I think within the first 10 years, they had 1 million visitors, as per the records. This is in the 19th century. So it's not like visiting museums is new to Indians. Clearly, we like it. Or maybe it's just the people of Jaipur, I don't know. But even then, Jaipur had its visitors from outside, right? So it's clearly not new in that sense. And so I think it's also about changing our mindset about, why do people come? What counts as a successful visit? So, I mean, sorry, it's not a direct answer to your question. I wouldn't be able to because I don't know in terms of quantities. But I do think that perhaps we need to rethink the position from which we evaluate, whether more people are visiting by.
Really needs to be thought about because, one thing, and I mean in the West and Japan, not just the West, but Japan, Korea, places, there's very much a sense that building a proper museum becomes a real positive for the local economy too, that it's going to bring a lot of visitors, and because of that you're going to have hotels filled up, cafes filled up, restaurants filled up, because people will make a destination. They'll go to a place just to see a museum many times. And it seems like, I always say, I really wish that like the NGMA in Delhi became such a place that when people were coming to India, they would be told, oh, don't miss the NGMA in New Delhi because it's such a wonderful place, you can't miss it. And I don't think that it is at this point. I don't think it's yet become a destination unless you're really interested in art. So, and I think the government misses that if they invested some money in building an iconic structure of some sort, even though that doesn't necessarily relate to the work of a museum, but it certainly would help make it a destination, which in the long run would be good for the economy. But yes.
My own views are that we don't maintain the museums that we have well enough. So I'm very reluctant to suggest that we throw more money at something new. I think we should learn to run what we've got better. I think a lot of things can improve by just renovating and sensitive adaptation. Because especially a lot of institutions like the NGMA are in historic buildings as well. So, that in itself ought to be a destination for that, in addition to what it houses. My sense is also, though, that places like the NGMA, perhaps in terms of foreign visitors to India, perhaps lose out because I'm not, despite the leaps and bounds by which Indian art has gained, visibility and traction and everything else. There was a long time when most of Europe thought, we didn't do art. Modern art, India, like what? So I think that a lot of visitors might not be tuned in. I don't know whether you could call it outright resistance or dismissal. I mean, I just don't know. So I'm just speculating here. So that may very well not be the case. But I also think that that may be a factor, particularly if we're talking about maybe older visitors who, in their youth were not seeing the Anish Kapoor's, or it's also about just familiarity with names and
Well, I was totally surprised a number of years ago when Subodh Gupta had his retrospective at the NGMA in Delhi, and I went to see that, and it was quite a long time after the opening, so it wasn't like right after the opening. The place was packed. There were so many people and so many young Indians there, and they were all taking selfies in front of the sculptures and all of this. And I was so happy to see that. I was just like, oh, I'm so glad people are coming and just getting excited about the museum space and getting excited about Indian contemporary art.
Yeah, I mean, so it tells you that it can happen. So I think what that tells me is that it's got to do with the kind of art, whether people relate to it. But also you just said that a lot of it was full of young people. So I mean, I think there are a lot of these factors that overlap that, just throwing money at a new building, sure, a better branding exercise or, making more of an effort to engage audiences on, modern and contemporary Indian art, all of that, sure. But throwing money at a new building, I'm a little less convinced that that's always the best way forward. I mean, I think education, even outreach, really, or just sharing is a gentler word. Outreach sounds like you're a person on a mission, but even within India, those kinds of initiatives would help a great deal. I mean, I think one of the good things that I've seen recently is the partnership that the Archaeological Survey of India has come up with, I guess, DAG, to open one of the barracks buildings at the Red Fort, because the Red Fort gets, a whole, not just in terms of numbers, a huge number of visitors, but a real cross-section of Indians and also visitors from abroad who visit the Red Fort, and they can go see this space. Which has different kinds of exhibitions, I think, the last time I visited. But, it's just at least a wider range of people are getting to see things. And I think the kinds of barriers to access as well, internally within India, is also something that we need to think about in that context.
I wanted to hold up your book, Painting and Photography in the Jaipur Court. And when I went to look for it before we signed on, I realized I think I loaned it to RVJ. I think he has it as a studio, so I can't hold it. But do you want to briefly just talk about you have 2 books out, I think. You want to talk about them just a little bit?
So I have, so that's, I mean, I've done a couple of museum, access related things, which are perhaps not so relevant to our discussion today, but as in co-edited them. So Painting and Photography at the Jaipur Court is the catalogue primarily of the exhibition at the
And you did that with Giles Tillotson.
We co-edited it. I wrote the chapter on photography, which I've just updated for a publication that Rahab's doing, because we were lucky enough to get in a little workshop on the photographic archive just before the lockdown. So this was at the end of February this year. So a lot of new questions and ideas that came up from that I've incorporated into this updated version. But I wrote the chapter on photography. Sonika, whom you know very well, Sonika Suni, did a great chapter on the paintings in the collection, which haven't been published or seen like this ever before. We've only got, there's some really real gems there, but we only obviously had space for a few. I think the gallery in total has about just over 200 works, of which roughly half are photographic material. So it's only about 100 odd paintings. But she worked on cataloging the collection, updating the documentation of the collection. So, and because of her own background, she comes from an artist family, so she has an eye for the kind of detail that you need to have an eye for. Really important essay that on the collection, because as I say, it's just not been published before.
It's a beautiful book. I wanted to hold it up, but what I'll do is I'll insert some photos from it.
Okay,
great.
Thank you. And, the catalogue portions are, replicated from the exhibition on which other people worked on as well. So,
and the concept of the book is basically in that exhibition was how photography and painting in the Jaipur court sort of intertwined and intermeshed.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to think of them as the visual arts at Jaipur. So between the founding of the city in 1727 and coming up to about 1947, a little beyond that, up to contemporary times, really. But I mean, the court, of course, ceased to be a court in that sense after independence. So it's about the visual arts at Jaipur, and painting and photography were the two dominant forms. And as you say, it's a story of how they interact, but it's also about how artists at Jaipur were responding to what they were seeing seeing around them, what the things that were being acquired by the Maharajas of Jaipur on their various postings, as it were, but also the art that they were able to, artists they were able to attract as patrons. Jaipur's location on major trade routes was a big impetus, but also, of course, paintings come into collection also through marriage and things like that, or gift exchanges. So there are lots of ways in which materials also make their way into Jaipur and to which they're responding. So that was the story we wanted to tell, that story of interaction, not just, this is what happened in the 18th century, and then this is what happened in the 19th century, and then photography appeared and boom, it all changed. No, it was a dialogue over a long, between these visual.
There was a lot of overlap. But also, there was hand-painted photographs. Hand-painted photographs.
Yeah.
Which, of course, I have a personal interest in. This is running long. I don't know if we should stop it. Do you think so?
But we should probably stop, and you should probably edit out, some of my more long and boring.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to edit out anything that you said, but I'll edit it to cut out some of those breaks that we had, the gaps we had because of our Wi-Fi connection. So everybody, thank you very much. This is Wazwo Evil O from Udaipur and Mrinalini Venkateswaran speaking to us from Chennai. Say goodbye, Mrinalini.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you
Mrinalini.
very much.
Okay, bye. Okay, that's good. Now we can talk a little bit.